Well, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you at this conversation on the future of work and well-being. And let me start by saying if you do have a camera and if you feel comfortable with it, then please do turn it on. We love to see faces. And then let me just acknowledge the National Science Foundation because they're partly funding this effort. And of course, the organizers, Linda Boyle, John Lee, Rafael Sadoun, Manfred Chelgi, and then Orit Chair, myself, who are here today. So logistics, this is a recorded session, and please post your questions in the chat, and Orit will be moderating those. So it's with great pleasure that we welcome our colleague, Birsen Donmez. So Birsen's a professor at the University of Toronto, Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering. And she is the Canada Research Chair in Human Factors and Transportation at the University of Toronto. So she receives her bachelor's in Bogazici University. You need to correct me, I must be slaughtering that. And then master's and PhD in Industrial Engineering and Master in Statistics at the University of Iowa. And her research interests are centered on understanding and improving human behavior and performance in multitask and complex situations. And I think that this clearly puts her in that domain of, you know, the future of work, especially as it relates to vehicles, and specifically looking forward to automated vehicles. So Birsen, you've explored driving from many angles, and recently you've worked on issues related to vehicle automation. So how's automation helping?
Right. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. When you look at the different types of automation that have been implemented in the vehicles, I'm actually a big fan of level 0 automation, right? People may not consider it to be as technologically advanced, but when you look at technologies like forward collision warning systems or autonomous emergency braking systems, these actually have been shown to significantly decrease crashes. And the reason is they are designed with the human attentional limitations in mind. A recent Insurance Institute of Highway Safety, IIHS report, I think it was just released in September, reported, I think about 20%, 22% for forward collision warning systems, like a crash reduction in trucks, and 12% for the autonomous emergency braking. So these are, you know, significant numbers. And they also had a report back in 2016 for Volvo City Safety System, which is, again, a kind of an automated braking system, emergency braking system for low speeds. And at that time, too, they have found significant reduction. So these systems are working. I'm a big fan. And when we look at kind of the more up and coming technologies, I am hopeful about systems that are, you know, what SA equals level 4, basically where systems work in kind of constrained geographies, right? Where uncertainty is a little bit less compared to trying to solve the problem of, right, completely making a passenger vehicle, a person-owned vehicle, self-driving. And way more recently stated that they're going to remove their safety drivers from these vehicles, right? So they're going to provide the service. And I think there are other companies who have started that or who are looking to start it. And really these type of technologies, right, I think they are more feasible because more expensive sensors can be installed on those vehicles. There can be more extensive testing within certain geographies. They can also help kind of improve more sustainable transport options, right? People talk about solving the last mile problem for public transit. And if we do have these technologies that you know, can help people move from their home to the closest subway station, etc., right? that can actually enhance sustainability and our well-being in the long run. And I also think, as someone who gets motion sick very easily, like I can never work in a car, but I could work on a train, right? So I know that this also relates to work. So I'm a big fan of that.
And then you also make the argument that sometimes automation doesn't help, right? So you recently explored differences in how novice and experienced drivers might engage in non-driving tasks and vehicles with level 2 automation. And just as a reminder, level 2 is assistance, right? The driver is still fully in charge. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so these level 2 vehicles, right, where you can have an adaptive cruise control system alone, it's fine because you're still engaged in the driving task. And then the lane keeping assist, alone it's fine on its own because you're still engaged in some way with the vehicle control. When you put them together, right, and if there's some sort of forward collision warning or an automated emergency braking, you are basically removing the driver from being actively involved in the task. So on paper, this sounded dangerous to me several years ago, I think, when I came out of grad school. At the time, I remember we had a conversation with my former advisor, John Lee, where we were wondering, well, are there going to be Tesla crashes? So he did say, well, crashes are such rare events that there may not be. So on paper, it was a bad idea, and we kind of see that, right? It is problematic in practice as well. So the study that, and the reasons are, right? You're removing the driver from that active task of controlling the vehicle. So it becomes a vigilance task, which is very hard for people to do. So, right, they might as well engage in a non-driving related activity to keep their arousal level up, right? So that they can actually take action. Because if they don't do that, then they're going to go into this drowsiness mode and then sleepiness, which is way more dangerous than, I'd say, non-driving related task engagement. So we have looked at a distraction or secondary task engagement for ACC and LKA combined in our driving simulator. So this was with 64 drivers, half of them novice drivers, like less than 3 years of licensure, not driving very much, and then half of them experienced drivers, you know, having license for more than 8 years, I think, and then 20K driving per year. I can't recall the exact numbers. And we also had half of the participants basically in driving in a kind of a non-automated version of our driving simulator. And we gave half of the participants also a secondary task, which was self-paced, right? There was incentive to engage in it, monetary incentive, and they kind of did it at their own pace. So, so that we could kind of see how they were moderating their distraction engagement. So for the manual phase of the study, as one would expect, experienced drivers were actually better at moderating their attention. So they actually, both groups were looking away from the road, kind of at the same level in terms of percent time looking away from the road. But experienced drivers were looking away more frequently for shorter durations, right? And we do know that that's actually better for safety. And when we switched to the automated version, right, with the LKA and the ACC combined, there were no failures or takeover requests. However, we had a practice drive where we have introduced the participants to automation failures, so they knew that they had to, right, monitor, because in our pilot, when we didn't do that, they didn't look at the road at all. So going from the manual version to the automated version, that gap actually expands. So I have my numbers here. I was curious to look at those. So mean glance duration for novice experience for non-automated was 1.3, 0.9. Right, for experienced drivers, it was under 1 second. When you switch to automated vehicles, it was 2.8 for novice drivers on the average. So they were taking 3 seconds away, right? And an experience for 1.3. So there was definitely an increase for both groups, but then the experienced drivers were affected less. So there are risks associated with this type of implementation of vehicle automation, and the risk is not uniform across different driver groups also. So that introduces more complexity basically to the issue.
So that's really interesting. And your team is also exploring how drivers' understanding of automation influences how they behave. So do drivers understanding lane keeping assistance systems and adaptive cruise control, is that what's going on here, do you think?
Yeah, so I think that wasn't an understanding thing in the experiment that we did. I think that was an experience thing, because both groups were kind of trained the same about ACC and LKA. But driver understanding definitely, I think, plays a role in terms of inappropriate secondary task engagement too, right, in the real world. So Chelsea, one of my students, is actually here, a PhD student. So this hasn't been published yet, but has been accepted. She has done an online survey, basically asking people about their knowledge of the limitations and capabilities of ACC and LKA systems. I think we recruited 440 people, and we had very few people who had used either of these systems but didn't own the system. So we excluded that group, and we looked at basically people who own either system or both. And then we looked at people who do not own or have never used. And then we looked at kind of their percent correct responses, but we also collected trust as well as reliance intention assessment, in the sense that, right, if you were given an ACC system, how likely are you to engage in this non-driving related activity? We have a bunch. So when you look at the literature, there was actually research 10 plus years ago on ACC, and some from Linda Boyle too. So we were curious to see the percentages, and really it doesn't seem like people have learned. So stationary vehicles and curvy roads are kind of major limitations of the ACC system. I think for our owners, we had, let me look at our numbers, 45% of the owners and 41% of the non-owners knew that ACC would have difficulty on a curvy road. Less than half. And less than 38% of owners and 31% of non-owners knew that it would have difficulty when approaching a stop vehicle. So owners know a little bit more, right? But not that much. I don't think it's a problem if they are only using one system, right? Because they can still step in. But I think the issue would become when you have these two systems together, and if you do not know these limitations, and if you're overestimating their abilities, then you might be more likely to engage in distractions. By the way, something that I want to point out here is so Chelsea implemented a lot of attention checks. So just a word of caution for other people who do online surveys, we actually removed over 100 people from the survey. So this was about a 20-minute survey. So it wasn't very long. It was long though, right? So what we learned is either do a very short survey or make sure that you are really incorporating a lot of sanity checks and attention checks to ensure that you're getting valid data.
I'm glad you're mentioning that, because I think all of us are in the same boat now, trying to learn new tricks of conducting research, since our driving simulators are sort of idle. So I see that there are questions in the comments. I want to get to those, but before we do, I just wanted to ask you about another recent paper where you introduced a taxonomy of strategies for supporting the driver as they're time sharing between the non-driving task and the driving task. So just please tell us about that.
Yeah, so that was kind of looking at the design space, right, to generate ideas in terms of how we can approach this issue. And it was slightly based on kind of a taxonomy that Linda Boyle, Johnny, and I developed when I was a grad student working with them, based on just distraction mitigation at the time. So it looks at kind of the task that's being targeted, whether it's the NDRT, non-driving related task or the driving task. Who initiates the strategy? Is it the driver? Automation, the timing, is the strategy engaged kind of pre-drive, during drive, after drive? I should have one more. And then kind of the level of intervention. So I'll give some examples. Let's say that someone is detected to be distracted by these automated vehicles, right? The automated vehicle can, like, if let's say drowsiness, it can stop the vehicle. It can give a takeover request. So these are driving related strategies that kind of differ in their level of intervention, but targeting the driving task. It could be non-driving related task. So for example, certain, the driver might be locked out from certain types of tasks. For example, for certain type of technologies, or let's say context within the road environment, maybe I shouldn't be moving my seat back and taking my laptop, right, on me, because if I do need to step back in, then I'd have to kind of readjust my control. So if I'm given less than a minute, I may not be able to do that. So these are also different kind of, and then there could be maybe just advising rather than locking the driver out from certain tasks too. So that's the level of intervention. In terms of driver initiating something, right, the driver can tailor, let's say, a warning system or a takeover request in anticipation of a very engaging task. So if you're going to do a conference call, right, and you may, this would of course depend on the awareness of the driver of their abilities, but you could say, okay, the takeover request threshold can be more conservative, right? Or give me a more salient alarm, because I may not be attending during this time. So that's kind of the taxonomy. It did help us generate ideas. I don't know if everything is good, right? But it kind of gets you to brainstorm for different dimensions of the design space.
Great, thank you. So we have some questions coming in, and I see that the questions, some are on kind of the content, and some questions I think we're all kind of sharing, as Andrew said, in the same boat, are on research methods. So maybe I'm going to start with content related, and then we will transition to discuss research methods, because I know that we're all thinking about research methods these days. Nadia, would you like to start with your first question?
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned that there's a risk associated with the automation, and like it is varied between different groups. So I'm curious to see if the users themselves like perceive this risk, like either through like perceived risk measures or trust distrust measures, and how do you think it would affect their adoption of full automated vehicles, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Probably subpopulations do. I don't think everyone does, just based on incidents that we see, right? People posting on YouTube, having their Tesla drive, and then getting in the back seat. Obviously, that person, right, has no appropriate risk assessment, and there might be people who are kind of risk averse, like myself, who wouldn't do things like that. I don't know if there has been any kind of survey studies trying to understand, like looking at different, let's say, age groups or personality factors that relate to that. But I think that'd be very interesting to study, and then maybe then have more personalized training for certain people.
Yeah, and I think that related to that, Peter had a question.
Yeah, my question was indeed related. It was, you put these people in an experimental setting for the first experiment and had them drive and whatever. And of course, you're trying to control things so you have the same amount of experienced and inexperienced drivers. But do you think that in the wild, the inexperienced drivers would sort of either consciously or unconsciously recognize that it's more dangerous for them to be doing this other task and actually engage in those other secondary tasks less often than the more experienced drivers?
Yeah, so that definitely a driving simulator setting is not like the real world, right? But I think in general for younger drivers, I'm going to say novice drivers were also younger, just kind of an inherent confounding. They are also more risk unaware. It'll be interesting to see, and they might be more willing to trust these technologies too. I do think we definitely need field data, right? Simulators kind of give us some assessments, but we have seen this with driver distraction research, right? Where I think we were kind of under the impression that certain distractions were more detrimental than they really are, right? And then we got the SHARP2 naturalistic data results, and that has kind of changed how we look at driver distraction, that people actually drive well when they're most of the time taking their eyes off the road, right? Without getting into a crash. So I think we do need field data. Simulators are kind of, right, it does help us explore certain things, but needs to be verified.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple of questions and kind of lively discussion about kind of surveys and kind of online research methods. So maybe kind of Joanne can ask her question.
Sure, thank you. Actually, we're about to launch an online survey. We're looking at remote operation and shuttle work. We've made a short survey, which I know is important. And we discussed this idea of having a catch trial. There's some sort of sanity check. I like your term. Do you have a good suggestion what we should use?
So I'm going to refer you to Chelsea. I don't know what exactly she used. I have seen it at some point, but this was, for example, let's say we were asking 30 questions about ACC, and in the middle somewhere it would be, you know, select this, right? So that this was kind of ensuring that they weren't just clicking randomly. She has also looked at kind of internal consistency. For example, we were asking people the model of the vehicle that they own, and then if we knew that that vehicle didn't have ACC or LK, but the person said that it did, right, out the window. I'm sure we have missed some, although we have thrown 1/3 away. But I think also if it's a shorter survey, it's probably there's less risk that people will kind of check out from the survey. But you know, if you're not talking on the phone to someone, you never know, right? How seriously they're answering.
Our preference is to grab them and talk to them.
Yeah, I think that's the best if you could do.
I think it's an interesting idea. It's certainly something we use in the lab with a lot of stuff. And so moving to an online format does change things up a bit, and there's the lack of interaction. But we'll be sure to build that in. Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe beyond surveys, I'd love to hear your thoughts about kind of transition to new research methods now when we don't necessarily can invite people to use the simulator in our lab. So what are some of the things that you have been contemplating? I know that there is some lively discussion about the limitations of online surveys.
Yeah, so that we actually are struggling. So for Chelsea, at least, I'm going to give her PhD as an example. The next step was to bring people into the simulator and then look at different training methods to see how they're kind of responding to different limitations of these systems. So what we might do is, again, another online version where we actually try to design the training material and then see whether people's responses in terms of their understanding enhances. Obviously, right, the issue with that is just because they get it right in a test doesn't mean that they'll get it right while driving. So unfortunately, there needs to be like actual driving data too. So that's so other than kind of the online platform, we haven't really found out any other creative ways to overcome this. So if anyone has suggestions, I'm happy to hear. Or if anyone wants to share data, right? Transport Canada would like us to help with the analysis. We'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, does anyone want to join the conversation and maybe share something different that they're doing or add a question about research method? Okay, I think we're all contemplating how kind of to move forward and how online applications and training materials might look like when they're not in the format of a survey. So we have been experimenting with kind of creating different interactive applications that have some kind of behavior recording into them, but they're not necessarily, they're not even close to simulators.
Actually, I can add one thing that we're looking at. I don't know that it's very useful for a lot of things, but because where I am in Ottawa in Canada, and we're under pretty strict constraints, people are being asked to pretty much hang out with their own family and less than 6 people. So they're called bubbles here. And what we're doing is we're providing shuttle transportation to see their interactions, but it has to be just their bubble, just the people that they're already working with. And so fortunately they can get there and be outside. Then we sort of clean down the whole shuttle, they get to ride inside, and then they leave, and then they'd have to clean the whole process again. So it's pretty labor intensive, but it's one way, but it's pretty tricky. And I know there've been some other talks where people talking about how they're still trying to maintain on-road studies and lab studies, but it's really challenging. Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, we have been actually, well, we haven't really been approved by REB yet, but the University of Toronto has allowed us to resume human subject data collection. So we had to do quite a bit of research in terms of sanitation, right, personal protective equipments. We haven't run any participants yet, but there's also the concern that, you know, my students, I don't want to say you should do, right? Because there's also a personal risk that the students are taking, or the experimenters. So yeah, ideally we should find alternatives as good as possible, right? Until things get a little bit better.
Albert, did you wanted to kind of jump in?
So I'll just put it very shortly. And so for me, one of the questions, a lot of the things we see at the moment, we hear, seems like it is basically trying to make the best out of the situation, but selling it too positive. So I think obviously we are scientists. We know there is just, at the moment, we are sort of, in Germany also probably heading towards sort of more restrictive times again. And so for me, it was really sort of 2 weeks ago, we went with 50 PhD students to a retreat that was possible at that time and also safe. And what I realized that I have been probably fooling myself the last 6 months a lot. And I think it's sort of, it is it's not meant as a negative thing. I think there is very little alternative, but I think what I ask in a way that we really are realistic at basically, do we really study what we want to study, or do we study things we can study in order to create the next paper? And I've seen a lot of that. And I think this is not what science is about. I think this is sort of, I think basically, and obviously we are very adaptive, so we can shift our interest, and after sort of half an hour debating with ourselves, we'll find it interesting. But I think there should be some honesty where, what do I really want to research? What is sort of, where do I want to make the impact? And I think sort of going to all the way to other things, would it hurt our community if we have 1 year of surveys? If people would basically synthesize the knowledge we have? And I think that's sort of, it sounds stupid at the beginning, but I think looking at how very few papers are really read, and I think you can do this if you go to a PhD exam and you take the best PhD students you have, you ask them in depth about papers people cite, you'll realize many of them haven't read the papers in depth or have synthesized this with other things. And I think people have done PhD exams a lot. It's completely trivial to basically put people in a very uncomfortable position once you go into the related work, which you know and they have cited. So I think one of the questions is really, and I think this is not meant as a joke, it's really, would we be better off don't do some of the research, but trying to synthesize. And if you have the pressure to publish, then publish different formats which are not sort of based on original research, but rather on synthesis, which I think our field HCI is extremely weak on anyway. But I'm sort of the old person ranting, so sorry.
No, I think that's another good suggestion, right? That's what some of my students have been doing, right? Some already had some data when we locked down, so they could do analysis, but some didn't. So we kind of took the time to do more kind of book chapters, higher level overviews, so on and so forth. And there's definitely value and the need. I do agree with Albert. But there's also the issue of a PhD student who's getting stressed because they don't feel like they're making progress, right?
So, but is this not us? I think sort of there are a number of senior people. I supervise the PhD student. I grade PhD theses. It's sort of given that. So if I have to choose from let's say I get a synthesis paper in the thesis, which has really read 50 papers that's relevant, understood them, build a taxonomy, put really something in, or I get a study which is mechanical Turk driving simulation with JavaScript, with original data and no insight, I know what I choose. And I think it's basically, I think the pressure we put on PhD students is probably that we look for the wrong things. I think, and as I said, we get excited very quickly because there are the digital means. We can do something online, we can do something in mechanical Turk, but the question is it really sort of the original idea I had when I talked to the PhD students when I hired them, or do we put sort of the wrong pressure on ourselves? And I think that's the more I see it now, the more I feel we may be sort of in a hamster wheel, which is a stupid one, and we could just basically step out and do something else for a few months, and it wouldn't hurt our field. It rather would even improve the PhD students' work. And I think it's not just book chapters, overviews. I think you can, if you look into other subjects, synthesis papers are something that it's not trivial, and it's sort of something of very high value. It's not a survey, it's basically synthesizing knowledge, and it's typically highly cited papers. But in HCI, I haven't seen many over the last 5 years because people just never have the time to go through 50 or 80 papers in great detail to do that.
Yeah, no, I do agree. Like so we're conducting a scoping review when we plan about 8 months or so doing that. And then if it turns into a systematic review where you actually do some data analysis at the end, right, it's even longer. So yeah, these are actually effortful tasks for sure. And so I think it's a good, I have a few PhD students here. So what you're saying, I hope is soothing them a little bit and encouraging that it's okay. not doing a simulator study.
Yeah, no, this is all food for thoughts for us. Anna, would you like to kind of jump in with the discussion you had with your students?
We were just talking about, when you just want them to read some of those papers that have been really good at getting you to think about your field. So we were having one of those meetings, and I was getting them to look at the paper that discusses all the different types of contribution and to think about where their contributions were going to be, and we were just saying how you really see in that graph that I sent the link to that there's all these different types of papers that we just don't really seem to publish very much. And of course, I guess they looked at the acceptance rates and were like, oh, I'm not sure I want to go there. But really, they're not that different, right? It's fairly flat across if you look at those orange bars. So it just seemed to me there was a lot of, it would be really useful, wouldn't it, if we had some of those papers that brought together whole areas of research into that kind of synthesis.
And I think that the acceptance rate you just shared, I think typically this is because somebody tries to do a meta-analysis over the last 2 weeks before the deadline. I think meta-analysis, if you talk to people from social science, from other subjects, this is serious research. This is not doing a survey. This is basically serious research where you have to basically define the language people use. You have to, so it is really, and I think this is sort of, so this acceptance rate is related to quality. It's a bit like you do an empirical study, but forget to do sort of the statistical analysis. You report basically the raw data, and you would not wonder that your paper falls out. And I think so we don't have the tradition of the high quality synthesis and surveys. And I think this is sort of a time where this could be changed.
Yeah, I do wonder a little as to whether it's also not always been so sympathetically received by reviewers, just because they're not used to seeing it. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, right?
Yeah, I think there are a few journals, so at least for transportation, there's transport reviews that kind of do publish those type. And there's a more recent journal, I think Chris published something there, is that right? The interdisciplinary reviews. I can't recall the title of the journal. It's a more recent one, and it does publish these type of papers. So, you know, maybe we may have to come out of the HCI field a little bit and look for other venues for those.
I've been working on quite a couple more theoretical papers over the last couple of years, and I want to echo the sentiment that Anna said, that they're not always so well received, because here's my perspective on what happens in our interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary fields. You combine two disciplines or two perspectives, and you explain to the other discipline, this is what that discipline knows. Your reviewer comes from a discipline, and they say, we already know this. And I think, I know you know this because you come from that discipline, but those other people that I'm trying to speak to, this is really useful for them. I think this is, I see lots of laughing faces in the chat, so this echoes perhaps with some people. I think that's something that easily goes wrong there within the HCI community, where the value of a good synthesis, not that I always had a good synthesis, I'll accept that some of those papers were rejected and were that there were things that needed to be improved for a next round. But I think merely there's a high expectation of novel data or an experiment. If you put forth a novel idea based on a literature synthesis where they say, and now where's the experiment? Andrew and I published a paper together where that was one of the things. Where they said, now tested. And I thought, well, based on the paper, I could do 20 experiments, and none of those individual experiments would do justice to the bigger idea we want to put forth here. But yeah, anyway, I encourage more of this work published, more synthesis. I'm happy with that work if it's done well. And I also agree that it's not trivial.
Glad to see this conversation, because I think that kind of promoting this kind of work starts with having us in a room, a virtual room, and having these conversations and having our PhD students here and our students here kind of listening and contemplating that. So I think that this is a really important conversation. Thank you for Birsen for kind of helping us kind of dive into this, and thank you for everyone that contributed.
Yes, thank you very much, Birsen. This was fun. So let's wrap up the formal part. I just wanted to say that next week we're going to be off, but in November we have 3 exciting conversations scheduled with Bastian, who I saw here earlier, and then Catherine Isbister and Aaron Solvay. So we're looking forward to those as well. So thank you again, Birsen, and let me stop the recording.